a 233-year-old bank collapsed because of one trader in Singapore. His name was Nick Leeson. To understand how strange that sentence really is, you have to picture what Barings looked like from the outside in the early 1990s. Marble lobbies, portraits of past directors lining the walls, a client list stretching back through generations of British aristocracy, and eventually, the royal family itself. Nothing about the institution suggested fragility. It had weathered wars, currency crises, and the collapse of empires without ever once failing to open its doors the next morning. That was the reputation Nick Leeson walked into. Barings Bank was not some minor institution. It was the oldest merchant bank in Britain, a name attached to centuries of quiet, respectable finance. Leeson was sent to Singapore to run something specific and, on paper, low risk. Simple futures trades in Asian markets, the kind of activity that was supposed to generate steady, unglamorous returns, not headlines. The Singapore desk was, by design, meant to be one of the least dramatic postings in the entire bank. Futures arbitrage, buying in one market, selling in another, pocketing the small difference between prices that should, in theory, have been identical. Done properly, this kind of trading barely takes on any real market risk at all. It was steady, methodical work, the financial equivalent of running a well-oiled machine rather than gambling on where prices would move next. That description is important because it explains exactly how far Leeson eventually drifted from what he was actually sent there to do. That is not what happened. Instead, Leeson began placing huge speculative bets, far outside the boundaries of what he had been sent there to do. And when those bets went wrong, he did not report the losses. He hid them. The mechanism he used was a single hidden account, numbered 88888888888. Every time a trade went badly, instead of that loss showing up in the reports that would have gone up the chain to London, it got buried inside account 888888, quietly, trade after trade, for over 2 years. 2 years is a long time to hide something this large from an institution with centuries of supposed financial discipline. The number itself is worth pausing on, because there was nothing sophisticated about the choice. 8 was considered a lucky number in the region where he was trading, and the account had originally been opened to quietly absorb small client errors, the kind of minor accounting mismatches every trading floor generates. It was never meant to be a vault for billion-dollar losses. It became one gradually, one bad trade folded into it at a time, until what started as a housekeeping account for rounding errors had swallowed the entire fate of a 233-year-old bank. It worked because of one specific, structural gap. Leeson was not just placing the trades, he was also the person responsible for checking his own trades, settling them, verifying that what he reported matched what actually happened in the market. He held both jobs. The trading desk and the settlement desk that was supposed to double-check the trading desk sat with the same person. Nobody at Barings had separated those two roles, and that single gap is what let 2 years of losses stay invisible. The two roles had grown together almost by accident. Barings had opened the Singapore operation quickly, chasing an early foothold in a growing Asian derivatives market, and speed came at the cost of the usual internal checks a more established desk would have carried from day one. Leeson had originally been sent out partly to help set up the back-office settlement function, and when the front-office trading role opened up, he simply kept both. Nobody made a single deliberate decision to hand one person total control. It happened gradually, through understaffing and convenience, the same way most catastrophic structural gaps tend to form. In most trading operations, this separation is considered so basic it barely needs stating out loud. The person placing bets on the market should never be the same person confirming to head office that those bets did what they were supposed to do. It is the financial equivalent of letting a student grade their own exam and report the score directly to the school. Barings had, at some point, either overlooked this basic separation or actively decided Leeson's dual role was efficient, a shortcut that saved on headcount in a distant regional office nobody in London paid much attention to. Here is the part that should make any manager uncomfortable. For most of those 2 years, nobody at Barings suspected a thing, because Leeson's reported profits looked incredible. Not just good, Incredible. Head office did not just fail to catch him, they praised him. He was treated as a star performer, the kind of trader other offices were told to learn from. The bank was, in effect, celebrating the exact person who was quietly bankrupting it, because the numbers he was allowed to report, unverified by anyone with real independence from him, said everything was going brilliantly. Picture the internal newsletters, the year-end bonus discussions, the meetings where senior partners in London pointed to the Singapore office as a model for the rest of the bank. Leeson's reported numbers were not just good enough to avoid suspicion, they were good enough to actively reshape how the whole organization thought about its own risk appetite. If Singapore could produce these kinds of returns on supposedly low-risk arbitrage trades, why not expand the desk? Why not give it more capital to work with? Every one of those decisions, made in good faith by people who trusted the numbers in front of them, fed more resources toward the exact hole that was swallowing them. There is a particular kind of institutional blindness at work here. Success that looks too good, especially from someone with no independent check on their own numbers, should draw more scrutiny, not less. At Barings, it drew the opposite. It drew trust, more capital, and less oversight. This is the part I think gets missed most often in the retelling. It wasn't that Barings trusted Leeson too much as a person. It's that they let one person's word be the only check on itself, and no amount of personal trust should ever substitute for that kind of structural separation. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine some moment where a sharp-eyed auditor should have smelled something wrong. In practice, there was no single dramatic red flag waving in front of anyone's face. There was only a slow, steady accumulation of unusual cash requirements, each one explainable on its own, none of them alarming enough by itself to trigger a serious investigation. That is exactly how structural failures tend to look from the inside, right up until the moment they stop being deniable. As the hidden losses grew, so did the cash needed to cover margin calls, the payments required to keep the losing positions from being forcibly closed out, and head office kept sending it. Again and again, more capital flowed to Singapore to cover calls that, if anyone had asked the obvious question, why does a supposedly low-risk, market-neutral operation need this much emergency cash, would have unraveled the entire scheme months earlier. Nobody asked. The money kept moving, the losses kept growing inside account 88888, and the star performer reputation kept the questions from ever getting serious. Each individual wire transfer probably looked routine to whoever approved it in London, a normal operational request from a busy, profitable desk on the other side of the world. Nobody sat down and added up the total flowing to Singapore over the full stretch of those 2 years because nobody had a reason to. The star performer story had already answered the question before it could be asked. Of course Singapore needs capital. Look at the returns they're producing. That single, unexamined assumption is what let the losses keep compounding, quarter after quarter, invisible to everyone who should have been watching. Here's where the story turns from a slow-building problem into a genuine collapse, and it happens in a matter of days. By January of 1995, the hidden losses inside account 88888 had reached $1.3 billion. Read that number again next to the size of the institution it was hiding inside. $1.3 billion was more than the entire capital of Barings Bank, a bank with 2 centuries of history behind it. Once the losses surfaced, there was no slow unwind, no gradual restructuring. Barings collapsed within days. A 233-year-old institution, gone in the space of a week, because one person, in one hidden account, had been allowed to both make the bets and grade his own homework. Inside the bank, the final days moved at a pace nobody had prepared for. An institution built around careful, deliberate decision-making, the kind that takes weeks to approve a modest loan, found itself facing a hole in its balance sheet larger than its entire capital base, with essentially no time to respond. There was no committee process fast enough, no emergency capital raise realistic enough to plug a gap that size before the bank's obligations came due. 2 centuries of careful institution building unwound in less time than it usually took Barings to approve a new hire. The bank was sold to a rival, ING, for £1. Not £1 million, £1. The symbolic price told its own story. Barings was not being bought for its value. It was being bought to make the collapse stop, to contain the damage, at a price that signaled there was effectively nothing left worth paying for. Queen Elizabeth herself had been a client of this bank. That detail is not decoration. It underlines exactly how established, how trusted, how supposedly bulletproof this institution had seemed, right up until the week it wasn't. It is worth sitting with just how small that number is next to the size of the news it accompanied. A single pound is less than the cost of a newspaper reporting on the sale. ING was not acquiring a business in any meaningful sense. It was absorbing a name, a client list, and a set of obligations in exchange for making the immediate crisis disappear from the front pages. Everything else, the profits, the reputation, the 2 centuries of accumulated trust, had already evaporated before the ink on that £1 sale agreement was dry. Regulators who reviewed the collapse afterward did not describe it as a triumph of criminal genius. They called it one of the simplest possible failures to prevent. Not fraud genius, just missing checks. One person controlled both the trading desk and the settlement desk that was supposed to independently verify him, and any competent internal audit, run with even minimal rigor, should have caught that structural gap within weeks, not years. This is, in some ways, the most damning detail in the entire story. Nick Leeson did not need to be a criminal mastermind. He needed one structural gap, left open by people who should have known better, and 2 years of nobody closing it. Compare this to the popular image of a financial scandal: elaborate spreadsheets, forged signatures, offshore shell companies built to launder the evidence. None of that appears anywhere in the actual Barings collapse. Leeson did not need any of it. The entire scheme ran on the ordinary reporting tools already available to him, funneled through one account that nobody else was checking. That absence of sophistication is precisely what should worry any manager reading this now. It means the same failure does not require a criminal mind on your team. It only requires an org chart nobody has questioned in years. What strikes me most is how boring the actual failure was. No elaborate scheme, no hacking, no forged documents, beyond what one unchecked account made possible. Just one person holding 2 jobs that should never have belonged to the same set of hands. The lesson for managers here is not really about spotting rogue employees, and treating it that way misses the point entirely. It is about structure. Never let one person both execute a decision and verify it. No matter how talented they are, no matter how much trust they've earned, no matter how good their numbers look. This is the part that is easiest for a manager to get backwards. The natural instinct after hearing this story is to ask, how do I spot the next Leeson? How do I read people better? How do I sniff out the one bad actor before they do damage? That question, however well-intentioned, misses what actually happened. Barings did not fail because they hired a dishonest person. Plenty of dishonest people never get the chance to bankrupt a 233-year-old bank because the structure around them makes it impossible. Barings failed because the structure around Leeson made dishonesty, once it started, invisible for 2 full years. Separate the person who takes the risk from the person who checks the risk. That separation is not an insult to anyone's integrity. It is not a statement that you don't trust your best people. It is an acknowledgement that trust, no matter how well earned, is not a control. It cannot be audited, it cannot be verified independently, and it fails silently, exactly the way it failed at Barings for 2 full years. Verification is a control. It leaves a trail. It catches problems within weeks, instead of letting them compound for years, inside a hidden account nobody else was allowed to see. This distinction matters far beyond trading floors. Any team where one person both makes a call and confirms their own results carries some version of the same risk. Whether that is a salesperson who reports their own numbers with nobody double-checking, or an engineer who both writes and approves their own critical changes, or a manager who both spends a budget and reconciles it. None of these situations require anyone involved to be dishonest for a problem to eventually take root. They only require enough time and enough silence for a small unchecked gap to compound the way account 88888 quietly compounded month after month in a bank that had every reason to believe its own good news. The fix, once you see it this way, is almost boringly cheap compared to the cost of getting it wrong. Separating two roles usually means one extra hire, or one extra reporting line, or simply refusing to let convenience quietly merge two jobs that were designed to check each other. Barings could have made that fix at any point across those 2 years for a fraction of what the eventual collapse cost. Instead, the fix never happened, because nobody was looking for a structural problem behind a star performer's glowing numbers. A single structural fix, separating the desk that takes the risk from the desk that checks it, would have stopped Nick Leeson in his first month, long before $1.3 billion accumulated inside account 88888. Instead, a bank old enough to have counted the Queen among its clients, a name that had survived 233 years of wars, panics, and financial crises, was sold for £1 because nobody separated two jobs that should never have belonged to the same person. Tell me in the comments, is there a job at your workplace where the same person both makes the call and checks it? That gap is exactly where the next Barings starts.